Good morning and welcome to the National Road Safety Partnership Program, Clarity Managing Grey Fleet and Other Lessons from 30 Years in Work Driving Safety, which is a bit of a unique one for us today, this webinar. So for those of you who don't know me, and if you're new to these, my name is Jerome Karslake. I'm the Director of the NRSP and its many activities. To find out more, please check out the NRSP website, register for our newsletter, or even better, follow us on social media such as our LinkedIn page. Today's webinar is going to go for 40 minutes. We're going to have a bit more of a discussion approach today. We're going to go through, interview Darren, ask a whole lot of questions. It's going to be recorded and we will be posting on the NRSP website, and there will be an email coming out to everyone tomorrow with a link to the website. So you can follow up again, or if you missed out, there's another way you can go ahead and watch it. So, and we also want to make it as interactive as possible. So throw your questions through as you go along, and the chat is open. Morning, Darren.
Morning, Jerome. Thanks very much for the opportunity. Looking forward to it.
Excellent. So, for those of you who don't know, there's a picture of Darren. If you didn't see him when he popped up in the video, Darren is associate professor at Griffith University, road safety research, and he leads the road safety research collaboration with MACE, Motor Accident Insurance Commission, and he works in the School of Applied Psychology at Griffith University. Associate Professor Wishart's research is primarily within the work driving safety area, collaborating and assisting organisations in driver safety and behaviour change to reduce the frequency and severity of crashes in organisational fleets. So we have an amazing person joining us today. You can see his full bio on the Griffith University website. And now I'm going to dive into our conversation, Darren. How's that sound?
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
Well, I gave you the formal, I spoke and read out the formal bio that Griffith University has on the website, but I don't think it does you justice. So who is Darren? Let's talk a little bit more about your experience, background. Why should you be here? Why should we be listening to you?
So my research is mostly focused on work driving safety and motorcycle safety. That's kind of the two main areas. I've got a background in psychology. I'm a registered psychologist, so it's a lot about behaviour change, both as an individual and in an organisational setting. So over the last more than 2 decades, I've worked with a lot of organisations to conduct research and try and result or get the research whereby the results have an on the ground at the coalface application. So we tend to translate a lot, not only into just scientific journal papers, but a lot of resources like yourself, Jerome, that are available to organisations, and some of those are available through the NRSPP. So that's pretty much me.
So you mentioned you're a motorcyclist expert. So I guess the key thing I'd always go to, if you're a motorcyclist expert, do you ride a motorbike?
Yeah, I do. I ride a motorcycle. It's actually my primary mode of transport. So for a lot of people, that is a little different. Here I am working as a researcher in road safety, and I ride a motorcycle. However, that's my primary mode of transport. I've probably seen more of Australia on a motorcycle than I have in any other type of vehicle. I also, to help me become a better researcher, some years ago I did motorcycle training qualifications. So I was, for a period of time, a registered motorcycle trainer as well. So that enabled me to better understand the research and the application of research in motorcycle safety. So I do a lot of work and with a lot of organisations, but also with the government, particularly in Queensland, where I do some advice and guidance on various strategies and things like that. So we're doing a current project in the motorcycle space on evaluating the training and licensing that's happening at the moment.
So it's fair to say then, I'd say you're very practical based, real world sort of focused in things you do.
Yeah, I like to translate the research. So you do the science, but it needs resources that are readily available and easily understandable to the person that needs to use them or wants to use them. So I'm always trying to tangibly create those opportunities where the information is readily available. The reports are written, and there's often executive summaries to a lot of the business reports that we do in our research, so that you don't, if you want the detail is there, but the executive summary will give you an overview. So yeah, so it's got to be applied. It's got to be translating to that.
So obviously by the title of this webinar, 30 years, so you've been in the game a long time.
Yeah, it's been a great journey. You've been in it for a long time yourself. I know a lot of people have been in it even longer than me. So it's a great journey, and I think that the thing that's changing, it's constantly changing. Whilst unfortunately our road injuries and fatalities are always there, we've got such changes in the technology and the road infrastructure and the way that licensing and training is undertaken has changed, and it's a constantly moving playing field. So I think that is something to sort of always try and keep abreast of. Yeah.
So we're focusing a little bit on grey fleet as one of our primary areas for our discussion today. How do you think you compare that to sort of traditional fleet? Are the management approaches the same, similar, different, or should we even define what grey fleet is to start with?
So grey fleet is a term that we use. It's for people. It's not for people with my colour hair that drive. It's
at least you've got the
term
hair.
we use. Yeah, it's a term we use for if you're driving in an organisation or for your work. It's the use of your private vehicle for work purposes. So oftentimes, historically, if you worked for a company, you often were provided, and still can be, a company vehicle, where a vehicle is provided by the company, paid for, the maintenance and the fuel and all those things are paid for by the company, and we refer to that as the traditional fleet. And a lot of companies still run a lot of that. And then there's this other area, which is the grey fleet, which is the private vehicle that's used for work purposes. It still does, in a lot of cases, the same activities. It's just a different model. Now, there are an example that you could use for that would be, you see commonly out there in the fleet work driving safety space, is companies or organisations or associations that have volunteers. Oftentimes those volunteers might be driving their private vehicle. So that vehicle, the volunteer is primarily responsible for all of the maintenance. It's their vehicle. They're responsible for the insurance and the upkeep of that vehicle. And that differs a lot from a company provided and or supplied vehicle. So there's a lot of different challenges associated with the risk management associated with grey fleet. I think, if you look at the legislation, if we just pick one, there's various legislation that applies, the transport legislation, road rules, all of those things, but also work health and safety. So any vehicle that's used for work purposes is a workplace. So therefore, people within the organisation, not only those that are operating that vehicle, but others within the organisation have obligations to ensure the safety. Now, with a traditional fleet vehicle, if you're, Jerome, working for a company that I'm in and I provide you with a company vehicle, then there's apparent more control from my position as a manager, for example, towards how you would operate that vehicle, etc. And we have legal obligations, both of us, about the operation of that vehicle. Now, in a grey fleet situation, if instead of giving you a company car, I said to you, I'll just pay you a travel allowance or reimbursement, and you used your private vehicle, I'm still obligated by law to ensure the safety, as are you, but I'm not in direct control of that vehicle. You are. I'm still responsible that it's insured and scheduled maintenance and things like that, but that's your car. So there can be some challenges associated with ensuring that the vehicle is covered off in all of those areas when it's not owned by the company, but rather the individual.
So how hard are those sort of challenges, you think? What are the limitations in doing that, in managing grey versus
Um,
traditional?
yeah, I, one of the things that I think is well, there's two main things with this. One is what I think companies should always ask themselves a question if they're looking at um, their traditional fleet versus their grey fleet is what processes around safety and use of, etc., traditional vehicle fleet do they have? And do they have the same type of processes and procedures and policies in place for their grey fleet? Because legally there's a similar obligation, but oftentimes what we find is companies have it lined up for the company provided vehicles, but have sort of not been aware necessarily of the implications with that with their grey fleet. And oftentimes we've been in situations, you and I have been in situations in public forums and things like that and said, you know, do you have any grey fleet? And companies have said, oh, no, I wouldn't have any of that. And then when they actually go and delve into the company, they find out they've got quite a fair few numbers. And so if they're not even aware of it, they may not have even developed the policies, the procedures, the safety supporting mechanisms associated with best risk managing that fleet as well. So one of the things with companies is to conduct a comparison about what are you doing with your traditional fleet and what are you doing with your grey fleet, and what are those differences and how can you overcome some of those differences. There's a challenge with that.
And what would happen? So say someone's driving a grey fleet vehicle and they're involved in an incident. Um, how severe does it have to be, do you think, before it's I guess where does it go? When would blame sort of come back to the organisation? Because you mentioned WHS, duty of care, those sort of things. When does it escalate up and suddenly it might be a major issue for an organisation?
Well, I mean, it should be escalated up whenever there's any incident. I would always say from a work driving safety aspect, whether it's a traditional fleet or a grey fleet, if there is an incident that it's involving a vehicle, now that can be, you know, speeding infringement, it can be red light infringements, it can be dings and bings, it can be, you know, a situation where there's a fault in a vehicle that people have become aware of through doing pre-start checks. All of those should be documented as an incident, and then some form of investigation and or management process, risk management process be implemented. And
Why
I
is that
always
so
say to
important?
companies, well, because ultimately there's so many people that die at work, which they die and are injured from motor vehicle crashes. It's the highest mechanism of injury for workplace fatalities in Australia, has been for more than a decade. So whilst we, in a workplace, we often risk manage, I think in companies sometimes we often risk manage other aspects of our workplace probably much more diligently than we do our work driving space. And the example that I say to companies, you know, put your hand on your heart and say, are you in your organisation managing the risk associated with work driving with the same level of diligence and consideration as every other hazard and risk in the workplace? In a lot of organisations, if you or I came into an entity and a premises and we tripped on a step, there's probably some formal work health and safety investigation process. But in a lot of organisations, if you bump or scrape a vehicle that's provided by the workplace, or even if it's grey fleet, there's often not the same level of investigation with that. And one of the challenges I think with that is that relates to sort of what we refer to oftentimes as near misses and things like that. And the example that I will use in a work driving setting is I was in a forum some years ago, and I said to an organisation, you know, I said to some participants in it, how many crashes have you had in your vehicle? And a participant put their hand up and asked me and said, if I'm reversing my company provided four-wheel drive and I reverse it slowly into one of those yellow bollards, do you count that as a crash? And I said, well, do you? Being a psychologist, you always answer a question with another question. So I said, do you? And the person said, well, if it's a slow speed maneuver and it bumps a bit of paint off and it doesn't really do any damage to the vehicle, he said, we don't even report that. I said, so you don't even report that was an incident at all? No, we wouldn't report that. It's nothing. And I said, so in the last 12 months, how many of those types of incidents have you had within your vehicle? And he said, 6 or 8. And I said, and none of them have been reported under any work health and safety or incident report or anything like that? And he said, no. And I said, so can you explain to me when that 4 or 5 foot yellow bollard becomes a child and you've bumped a child over, now you've had your first fatality, and everybody's sitting there going, how did that happen? We're unaware of how and why. And I'm going, well, you've had 6 or 8 near misses in the last 12 months notifying you that that's a possibility. So the point being there is that there can be a fine line between what is an injury and or fatality crash and an incident that can be, shoved aside or not thought of as a major issue in work driving. Yet we often don't do that with other hazards in our workplace. If we trip on a cord in the workplace, there's a big hazard risk management approach to that. So I think we need to translate that risk management thinking across into our work driving space.
I think that's so. If you're taking that data and begin recording, how much harder is that then for Grey Fleet as well? Like with those sort of instances, how do you capture that?
And that's one of the challenges with Grey Fleet. The question you pose with an organisation is there's lots of different ways that you can do that, but each organisation operates somewhat differently. So the question is, what are you doing with that in your traditional fleet? And then how much of that, of what you've already developed, let's not start with a blank sheet of paper. Let's see if we can move some of our policies, procedures, processes, recording mechanisms from that area across into our Grey Fleet, and then manage some of the challenges associated with that. One of the challenges with a Grey Fleet is, as a private vehicle driver, how do I tell you, Jerome, that, I'd want you to operate your vehicle a bit safer, or that you need to get your scheduling. So you need to build in those checks and balances that says, if I'm managing people using their Grey Fleet, is there a procedure that you've implemented that gets them to that you can check that it has been, serviced in accordance with the schedule, that the vehicle is insured, that it is registered, that there are pre-start safety checks done on that vehicle by the driver before they take off, and that's recorded so that you can ascertain that those things have been done. And they're things like walkarounds on the vehicle to check that, the tyres are not flat at the bottom and they're not slightly bald, and that the lights work and things like that. So if we do that, that's a checking of the vehicle before it even goes out. And it's about having that data on record so that, particularly if it goes pear-shaped, if an incident occurs, it's a fairly daunting process in any work organisation when a safety incident occurs, that you've got to then find the information and evidence that you have obtained that says that you have risk managed that. So in a private vehicle or Grey Fleet situation, what processes do I in my company need to embark upon? And again, go back and use your traditional fleet as a template to then look at what can we do. And if I was employing you, Jerome, and you're driving your own vehicle and you had a bad crash, what evidence have we got as an organisation that indicates we've undertaken that risk management approach? Because if it goes to court and there are any prosecutions, that's what you have to do. And it's really hard to retrospectively scramble around trying to find, well, what do we do? To give an example in a work driving context of a slightly different nature, recently within organisations. We found that there wasn't a lot of documentation around journey planning. So before people embarked upon journeys into various, remote regions, of which there's a lot in Australia, of course, companies or staff were often doing journey planning, but it was all done in their head. Oh yeah, I've driven that route before, so I know I've got to stop here and I've got to do that. And the question I posed is, if it goes pear-shaped, where's the evidence that it was done in the first place, that any of that was considered? So I think you need to make sure that you gather that, and Greyfleet has its challenges with that. But if you use the model that you've already got for traditional fleet, a lot of that will pull across. But what doesn't, you can then come up with, okay, well, what are some of the solutions? Because each company will have to tailor that to their own circumstance and need to a degree.
So you walk along, what happens? Like, how far up the chain does it go? Like you mentioned, because a lot of people are like, oh, it's never happened. So how important is it? How big is the risk if it's never happened to us? And how far up does the prosecution go?
Yeah, well, I mean, legislatively, we've got different legislation available or applicable in various sectors. As you would know, the heavy vehicle sector, you've got chain of responsibility, so it can go right to the top. Now, in the light vehicle fleet, there isn't a direct chain of responsibility legislation per se, but there is the work health and safety legislation that's lining up very similar. And there is plenty of evidence. You can, go and do a Google search, and we've even got some of those resources available through the NRSPP. I know you've got those, where there's been cases of light vehicle fleets where an incident has occurred that's resulted in a fatality, and there's been prosecutions. Now, the prosecutions can go in those instances all the way up to the CEO or the owner of the company as well. So it's not just about the driver anymore. So, if we go back, 20 or 30 years, a lot of focus was on the driver. And whilst the driver is the person, as we've always said, is the person that's ultimately got control of the vehicle in that time and moment, there are a lot of impacting factors. It can be organisations can put time pressure under them. There can be fatigue issues, distractions, all those sorts of things. And people make mistakes, people speed on occasion, those sorts of things don't operate within the law. So what do you have in place to manage that, so that when if an event does occur, you can have a defence as to what you were doing for that risk management? Now, one of the things that I think is the danger in organisations at the moment with Greyfleet is, if you're in an organisation, and there's some big organisations at times that operate a mixed model, so there's a fair proportion of vehicles of traditional fleet, and then there's a fair proportion that are Greyfleet. And as I mentioned before, a lot of organisations have a lot of policies, procedures, processes, documentation, evidence, and everything around their traditional fleet. And if you're not doing a similar type process with Greyfleet, potentially, if it went pear-shaped in the Greyfleet, a prosecutor could actually use your own evidence of how well you manage it in your traditional fleet as evidence of the deficiencies you've got in your Greyfleet. So that can be a bit of a danger. So there are prosecutions that result in jail for people up the chain within the organisation, and also major fines for organisations as well. And there's been some of those in, I think, nearly every state.
We're getting some good questions through as well, Darren. I'll go through because I know there's been a bit of doom and gloom and sort of fear coming through, but we'll give it a lot of positivity as well. So and this question that coming out is a really good one. And the point is what controls would you recommend for low-level incidences as well? IG, for that reversing into a bollard one you mentioned.
Yeah. Well, the first thing that I would suggest with those sort of things is, if you're having those sorts of incidents, the first thing you need to do is have a bit of an investigation as to, is there a particular place that it's happening? For example, a lot of company car parks could do with an audit, especially underground car parks, things like that. what processes do you have in place for your drivers? What audits have you done in terms of the vehicles? Are the vehicles got blind spots in them? Have you taught people how to utilise the technology that's in the vehicles, the reversing sensors, the reversing cameras? And I think with the reversing camera situation coming into vehicles, we're getting some more that are 360 degree, which is good. But, a lot of people focus then on the camera and don't actually still use their mirrors. One of the other things that I think is interesting is to try and encourage people when they're reversing to reverse really slowly. If you go and have a look at any time people reverse, whether it's in a car park, in an underground garage, or a parking lot where they reverse, people often are in a hurry or whatever, and they reverse quite rapidly. And I will always advocate, get some campaigns together within your organisation, get people to reverse a lot slower. If the example I use, if you're reversing and the sensing and the sensory beepers are going off, the first thing you need to do is stop immediately. They're going off for a reason. Sometimes that can be a false reason, but the amount of people that you see, the reversing sensor goes off, but while they're checking what that might be, the vehicle's still moving. So that can be a danger. So it's about visiting those sorts of things, I think. Yeah.
Would another one also be, how about you reverse into your bay and maybe very slowly drive out an easy way out, especially if you're driving one of the big vehicles?
Yeah. And have you got any promotional or educational material available in your organisation that encourages people to do that? That people are in a hurry. Let's be honest. People in a workplace, a lot of people are in a hurry to get somewhere. And when you're in a hurry, people often don't look, they don't check, they don't double check. They're going out a lot faster. And one of the challenges, if you're going that little bit faster out there, is by the time you perceive that there's something not right, you haven't actually allowed enough space by the time you react. So, you're going to hit something or something else. An interesting thing, just going back on your reversing incident, I mentioned to look at, if I go back to the yellow bollard part, I did an audit years ago. It was a company that had come and seen me about, they were having a lot of bumps and dings and bings and bumps and scrapes in their car park. And so I did a car park audit. And just one of the things that I picked up, there was a few things, but one of them I particularly like, and I've used it many times, and that was they had, it was a typical underground car parks, fairly dark, fairly grey. So, a lot of car parks and premises, they paint the bollards or the supports in a bright sort of fluorescent yellow so that you can see it. And I said to the person of the company I was there, I said, it's great that you've done that. However, if you sit in a vehicle and look in the rear vision mirror, you'll notice you can't see the yellow paint on the pole because you've only painted it 4 feet high. My suggestion would be to spend a little bit more money on some more paint and paint the whole bollard so that you could see it. So that's just an example of something that came out of a site audit,
I like that. And I think the other part, that point you made about people rushing and pressure and this sort of stuff. Because I remember I was talking to an organisation just the other day, and they were pointing out that our people are always under pressure. They're always behind. So they're always their KPIs. They've got to meet them. They've got to get the sales, this sort of stuff. Well, there's your driver. You're creating your own problem because you're pushing the limit, and they're always trying to squeeze more. So their focus is on the next job, not in the moment.
Yeah, and that's something that, again, you need to investigate. Well, why is that? Why is it that they're feeling that pressure? And bearing in mind that time pressure can be real or it can be perceived. It doesn't have to be real. It can be perceived time pressure, but oftentimes it is real. Let me give you an example in a different context. I was asked to do some work with an organisation who had, they were in the healthcare sector. So had drivers that had to go and see clients at their homes, that the clients were less fortunate than you and I, and they needed somebody to assist them to do typical daily required activities each day. Now, the company at the time was getting a lot of clients, and they were a little bit resource lacking. And what we found is that the drivers of these vehicles were picking up, compared to other organisations, a disproportionate amount of speeding infringements, really disproportionate. And I investigated and said, well, I wonder why that's happening. So I went and talked to the drivers and looked at some scheduling. Now, these people were visiting clients less fortunate than us in their homes, and the resourcing at the time was that they didn't have enough people and or resources to do these tasks, and they were actually taking more bookings. So you could actually, as an example, on those average days, you could see about 6 or 7 clients in a day if you were one of those workers. But they were scheduling 10 to 12 clients per day for those people. Now, in some organisations, you would be in a position where you just go, look, I can't do that much work in a day, and you would get done what you get done. In this particular entity, it attracted people that are obviously in the healthcare sector who are very, I use the words, altruistic. So they're dealing with clients that, and these clients needed them to assist in typical day-to-day tasks that you and I in our state would probably feel, take for granted. And instead of only being able to do 7 or whatever in a day, the staff would feel obligated within themselves through their altruistic nature to assist every client. So what we found is that they were trying to make up time between their clients by speeding. So they were getting speeding fines going one direction down a highway and then getting a speeding fine the same day coming back to going to different clients. And that's an example of, the increased risk that process, contributed to, because these people were not going to stand there and go, well, I can't see those other 4 clients today. They're just going to have to fend for themselves. So that's
they're those amazing special people. Their focus is so much on giving to others.
Very much so, and putting themselves in danger to do that.
Yep.
So that's a particular challenge. Now, if you add into the mix, in some of those sectors, those people might be, number 2, volunteers, and number 3, they might be driving their own vehicles. So that can add some further complexity. So if they're overloaded with clients, the vehicle might need a service. Is that getting done? Because that would take the vehicle off for a day or a half a day. So that's the complexities of those processes that need to come into play. Yeah.
This next question, I think this is the question all the organisations have to deal with, and you may know where I'm going to go with this one, but this is a great one. A common response I get in my vast grey fleet, so this person lives and breathes grey fleet, obviously. This is my own vehicle. Why should I tell my employer about every little scrape to my car?
You will probably meet resistance. Yep, absolutely. But again, I think that's about having conversations with your drivers. So firstly, yes, if it's their private vehicle, absolutely it is their private vehicle. However, when it's used for work, now you've put some obligation on the management or the leader of that team or organisation. So it's a dual responsibility there. However, if you go back to the risk component and caring that, as an organisation, hey, we care about our people too. If you're having bumps and scrapes, if we don't know about it, we don't know if there's a knowledge deficiency, an education. Is there a skill set that's not occurring? Is it a particular depot, car park that we're asking you to go to that we could actually do an audit and fix some things that might be challenging with that? So I think it's in first a bit of a conversation and create an understanding that there is that fine line between a bump, a ding and a scrape versus something that can be more serious.
And that's the point here that was raised. When we use the term near miss, are we not giving enough weight to the actual incident, like bumping a bollard?
I think yes, near miss is a challenge, and I think as a starting point. So one of the challenges we've had when we say to entities about can you collect near miss is then the definition of a near miss, and so that could be driving down the road and two vehicles passed close by and it could have been a catastrophe, but it didn't result in anything. And sometimes people, what I say is people are not aware of how close that near miss was to being something more. But if you've got an impact situation, whether it's a bollard or something else, then that's a bit of a difference. So that's a bit more evidence that it's actually not a near miss. It was actually an incident. You just haven't evaluated it as such. What's the difference between a near miss or an incident that is hitting a bollard or a bump and a scrape versus you and I slipping on the front step coming into an organisation up the stairs? They both have the opportunity to be a lot worse. So we need to capture them so it can help inform what our risk management strategies and processes can be. We don't know what we don't know.
And there's a question just building on a point you raised earlier around, are you aware of any legal action taken against companies regarding grey fleet related instances? Because I think it's one of those hard things to make the case to the powers that be that we need to have systems in place.
What I'll say there is you can have a look at, there are certainly a lot of cases, even in private vehicles, of prosecutions where it's resulted in death or serious injury. So I can't answer the question off the top of my head because I don't have any cases sitting in front of me, but there is highly likely some grey fleet incidents.
And hopefully, if we have budget in the Commonwealth project that we're working at the moment on grey fleet, we'll add part of the literature scan to that to look at all the case laws and summarise them. So when we put it in, we didn't have that in our scope, but hopefully we'll pick it up if we can allow. Another question here.
Because one of the things, Jerome, is oftentimes people in some instances are not aware of that legislation that applies. People often think a lot of companies move towards putting grey fleet into their fleet as an accounting strategy and as a greenhouse gas emission strategy. If I've got 1,000 vehicles in my fleet and I'm struggling to meet greenhouse gas emissions, I can reduce that to 600 vehicles and have 400 grey fleet, and now we're in the numbers. Or we might be in a situation where the company doesn't want to have as many assets in vehicles through depreciation, etc. So we can, move that across. So I think one of the challenges is we're getting more and more grey fleet in our organisations, and we need to address that before it gets in that situation where an incident has occurred and we're going, how did we not know about that?
Well, what about the insurance side? Where does that land? Can it be affected, influenced by grey fleet, positive, negative ways? Does that sort of sit? Another sort of question?
Yeah, that's probably something to more talk with insurance providers than myself, with their actuaries and things like that. But certainly, there's going to be situations where, if you're operating your vehicle as a workplace, but it's a private vehicle or your grey fleet, if you have incidents, that's going to influence your insurance without a doubt. But you'd have to talk to insurance providers about what that would be.
And I recall back when we did the first guide back in 2017, we had a lot of insurers involved, and a lot of them were just making the point is, as long as you allocate or you have a portion of it on your drive, your insurance cover to say this is 5, 10, whatever it is, you just need to make sure it's recorded somewhere. Once again, it goes back to the point earlier, there needs to be a record that you've gone through and done it.
Yeah, well, one of the things when we did that work, Jerome, if you recall, with that, there was moves in the insurance sector whereby if you're using your private vehicle for work, when you insure it, there's a tick box situation on a lot of insurance policies that says, is it used as a work vehicle? And if a lot of people may not realise that if they tick that it's not, in the future, potentially, there might be an incident where it's really evident that the vehicle was used for work, because there's different insurance premiums associated with that.
Mm.
And if it is used for work, and the insurance sector said to you and I at the time, if there was a particularly strong case, there might be a situation where they may fight the case of paying out on an incident if it was a work-related incident, but the vehicle was not indicated on their insurance policy that it was being used for work. How that would play out, don't know yet, but that's a possibility.
Well, I was chatting with WorkSafe just the other day, and I said, if you wanted to actually assess, I guess, driving for work, if you recorded the data and you said, what was your purpose of journey? Was it private or work-related? I think we'd get a clearer indication very quickly as to what's going on.
Yeah.
Do you recommend organisations have a policy around the age of grey fleet vehicles? I know this is a hard one.
I think the short answer is yes. You do need to have a policy around the age of a grey fleet. The example that we've used in workshops is, if you don't, then potentially, if I was transporting some people in your organisation around, I could go and use my 1956 Mustang to drive people around, which is a lovely car, but it doesn't have all of the safety features that the modern vehicles do. So does that, and if you're a company that's running both grey fleet and traditional fleet, the question would pose, if you had an incident in grey fleet, is you've got a situation where your traditional fleet you might have a policy that says it needs to be 5-star ANCAP rated because you're providing your employees with a vehicle. And if your grey fleet was not of the same, why? Why is that not the same? Does it need to be? So I certainly think there needs to be, if you're operating grey fleet, I think you do need some policies around the age of the vehicle.
And I think it's where you can look at used car safety ratings and other sort of things as well, which can help guide. There's a point here which I thought is quite interesting around that vehicle selection. Modern fleet risk management includes monitoring staff speed through GPS. I spend too much time ensuring I'm driving under the speed limit, and it's very distracting. So it's the reverse side. We're putting technology in to try and reduce the risk, but it's having additional flow-on problems.
Yeah, there's technology is a tool. All technology in vehicles is a tool, and there are challenges with all tools. They're certainly not seen, or shouldn't be seen, as a silver bullet or a golden gun. There have been, instances of people reporting that they're becoming very focused on what the speed is doing, and then there's also challenges associated with, if people are using a GPS system versus what their speedo is telling them, because there could be differentials associated with that. So there are a lot of challenges that need to be investigated and looked at with that.
I think vehicle selection comes out another important one as well. It's like finding a vehicle with, say, really good adaptive cruise control or those sort of things, when you just set that speed and you work with the vehicle instead of trying to focus on the speed. So go ahead.
Hang on, you dropped out. Try again.
You go ahead. You're about to say something, Darren.
I think I'm a big fan of using cruise control, especially a classic that I will say is a great thing, as well as using it on the highways and things like that people do. But the classic example is, if you've been travelling on regional roads at a typical speed limit of 100 kilometres an hour, and you come across a town or a speed zone, and it's through a town and it's 50 or 60, it's a really good idea to use your cruise control at that point, because then that's one thing you don't have to worry about. You're in an unfamiliar area, usually it's an unfamiliar environment. If it's 50 or 60, there's potential vulnerable road users around. You can focus on looking out for those, or cattle, or whatever it is that's, in those type of environments, and not then worrying about are you getting into speed creep. Because if you've come off from doing, a journey for the last hour or whatever at 100 kilometres an hour, and you're coming into a township at 50 or 60, it's really easy to slow down and have the intention of slowing down to that speed limit, but then inadvertently speed creep. And even with today's modern vehicles on the highways, I use cruise control and advocate it all the time, because speed creep is a really easy thing to occur with the way that modern vehicles are built, where they're quieter inside, the air conditioning's on, you've probably got a stereo on or some music playing or something, and it's really easy to creep up in the speed limit a little bit without even realising it.
And some vehicles also have quite poor systems. So once again, test those sort of things, because I know my parents have, their one is appalling, especially for the quality, and it will just slide up and down when you have it set. Whereas what I have, it just sits like a rock, and it will sense the car pulls back. And I think that's what people need to choose, make sure, is the technology as good as what they say it is? And that's where Test Drive put it out there. Diving back in, how can we practically manage grey fleet in line with internal fleet requirements, e.g. rego, insurance, safety of private vehicles? It seems to be such an administrative, or so many parts going on around it, and post-incident controls as well.
Yeah, well, the first thing that I would suggest, this is not an easy fix. It'll take some time, but the first thing is, so set up, if you've got somebody that's driving grey fleet for your organisation, okay, when is their registration due? Have that as a date that they provide. There's get some basic information so that you can then put into your systems and processes that every year you're checking that, yes, that's done. Services X amount of kilometres, is that done? And just build as a starting point those checks, so that the only difference that it is from your traditional fleet is that you're getting, in the first instance, get the owner of the private vehicle to get those dates to you, so that you can, in the kilometres and things like that they're traveling, their odometer's reading, so that you can put those checks and balances in, and then, send a communication that says, our records show that your registration is due for renewal in this month. Could you please ensure that you send a copy or confirm that it's registered? That's a simple start at that point.
And I think that's a really good point. You don't have to try and do everything all at once. It's looking at your resourcing, the plan, how you bringing people on the journey, because you don't want to overwhelm the whole system. Would that be fair?
Yeah, and I'm a firm believer that if you identify gaps in the processes, this is with traditional fleet or grey fleet, identify gaps that you have, then come up with a plan to address those gaps and a time frame that you intend doing it. You can't do it all in one day. But if you start and you work to that plan, if an incident does occur, at least then you have some evidence that says, well, yes, we had identified that as a gap and we're working on it, and to date we've done this, but we've still got this to do. So you've at least, provided some evidence that you didn't become aware of the gap and you haven't done a thing.
Yeah, you've got a long-term plan and you're systematically working along, and like anything, Rome's not built in a day, yeah?
Yeah. But what you don't want to do is identify, for example, that, if I went around to your organisation today and found out that you had 200 grey fleet vehicles, and so you don't have a policy and you don't have any of these procedures, and in 12 months' time you still haven't got any of them, that's a bit of a worry. You've identified a gap and you haven't done anything. Then if it goes pear-shaped, you've got no evidence that says you're doing anything about it. You've got evidence that says you didn't do anything about it.
And what about if someone raises it as a concern in the organisation as well? There's a record of that.
Same thing. If you've got it identified as a gap, what's the plan to address the gap, and by when? And what resources do you need to do that? And some of it is low-hanging fruit. It's easily fixed. It's not a big task. Some of it is more strategic and takes long term. but if it takes long term, what are the small steps that you can do along the way so that you have a progress and you make progress towards where that end goal is.
By the way, we've got mountains of questions, but we'll struggle to get through them all. But I really love this one because this is a modern something that's relatively new as well. And it might be quite easy to answer. So many staff now work from home or finish on site and drive directly home. Use of private vehicles then may have a cost benefit as opposed to staff returning internal vehicles to headquarters. Does the risk associated with grey fleet outweigh the cost benefit of these arrangements? I love that question.
Yeah, that's good. Look, again, the risk, if people are driving any vehicle for work, there's the risk. I think, again, what you need to have in is what are the policies and procedures, and I call it the rules of the game. What's the rules of the game you're explaining to your team as to what the expectations are or aren't. So what do you need to do to, mitigate that risk? I mean, I think people working from home, from a risk perspective, in one aspect, that can be a good thing because now they're not traveling to and from work, which is a less risk. So it's risk mitigated there. But you still,
Power didn't go off, mate. So you've come back.
Yeah.
I'll move on because we didn't quite capture the end of that one. But here's a quick question for you. Is speeding a near miss?
Speeding is an illegal activity. It's
near miss?
Illegal.
Yep.
I think it's more severe than a near miss. It's an event.
Yep.
It's an event. It's an illegal activity. If you're not addressing and risk managing speeding, and I'm talking here about infringement notices in the first instance, right? You need to. What policies and procedures and consequence management processes do you have in place about that? Yep. The other danger that you may have if you are not managing or monitoring speeding infringements is how are you ensuring that your drivers are currently licensed if they have speeding infringements, especially in today's environment whereby, on public holidays, you can lose double demerit points. So, it's easy and I certainly wouldn't want to be in a situation where you're providing a vehicle and, you're not monitoring and managing speeding infringements. So here's practice in a company we did some work with some years ago. They had a lot of speeding, so they were having an amount of speeding infringements per month coming through to the company cars, for instance. And one of the things we noticed was that the people that were driving the company provided vehicles, driving safely and driving in accordance with the law was not at that time written in their position descriptions, yet most of those people out of a typical 40-hour week were driving probably 15 to 20 hours a week. Wow. So it comprises a high proportion of their work day, a significant, proportion of their work activities. So if it was any other piece of equipment, that operation of that piece of equipment would probably be written in the position description that it had to be operated in a particular way and in accordance with policies, etc. So what this organisation did to start managing this, and this is the thing that you could aim for, is it was a big exercise. This is the not the low-hanging fruit. This is the high-hanging fruit that takes strategy and time. They organised with their company that anybody that got a company vehicle provided, their position description would be rewritten with HR, that driving safely for work and in accordance with the company's policy was now a component of the position description. So now you've got something that's outlining the expectation and you can manage against that. They then implemented a policy that everybody that was driving company vehicles, if a speeding infringement came into the company, because the vehicles were registered to the company, The driver lost driving privileges and were taken down to the transport authorities to print out a history of their license record
Ah,
to come back and demonstrate that they still had points on their license. And if they did, they were given the keys back to the car. So they rewrote, and what the company did is budgeted for the first year as if every single person driving a company car might have to go down and pay the fee that was to get the license history, right? And at the time was $30 odd. So they budgeted an amount to do that, and they didn't have to use all that budget, of course. But I can tell you that on the day they brought all of that policy in, 3 people that drove company vehicles resigned on the spot.
wow.
And we later found out they had been driving. The longest one was 9 months unlicensed in a company vehicle. Now think of the implications for that. If you've provided a vehicle to an employee that is unlicensed and that person has a pretty bad crash, that opens up a pretty big can of worms.
Huge.
Yeah.
Especially if it's a fatal.
Absolutely. So then the question that comes in, if it's a fatal, from a prosecution and a court perspective, is, so what have you done to ensure that your driver who you're giving that vehicle to was licensed? What have you done? Have you ever checked their license? Oh yes, we checked it when they first started employment with the company 10 years ago. It doesn't cut it very well.
And I think
So
that's really important.
That's where you go to in the future. Is I will ask everybody, if you're giving a vehicle to a company employee, is driving for work written into their job description? Because it needs to be.
Well, pulling that thread a little bit further, and we're coming up to time soon, and what we'll do is with these questions, we'll go through and we'll do a bit of interview outside. We'll write up answers to each of them and we'll circulate it back to the group because we've been inundated. It's been great.
Yeah, terrific.
Do you feel... Oh, it's been good. Do you feel grey fleet vehicles present more risk than fleet pool car vehicles?
I think they present more risk in the manner of not managing the risk. That's the risk. I don't have any evidence, this is better to say, I don't have any evidence that grey fleet are crashing any more or worse than traditional fleet. You would be able to ascertain that within your own organisation. But I think at the moment, they're a huge risk through the lack of risk management processes in a company.
Nice. I think even the big one is if you have got a pool vehicle, do people actually understand how to drive it? Like, have they been onboarded? Do they know where? And it's not just the safety technology, even the 101s, the windows, the air conditioning, turning the car on, the backing, because you get into a new environment. How do you know?
Yeah. We're actually doing a research project at the moment on determining what people do when they get into pooled vehicles, because there's such differences, and we're developing what we hope to be what we refer to it as a steering wheel kit. It's a resource that will help people sort of in that space. Yeah. The other thing I'll just point out, because I know we're getting close to time, just going back to the grey fleet, I also we think grey fleet is fairly important, and as such, we have just recruited and have now a PhD student just commenced doing a research project for the next 3 years on grey fleet. That's how important it is. So they've been funded a scholarship to do that.
So Darren, in the last few moments, what's your take-home message you'd like to leave with everyone?
I would like you to go and look at what you're doing with your traditional fleet in terms of risk management policies and procedures, and investigate your grey fleet and start moving the grey fleet policies, procedures, and risk management up to the scope of your traditional fleet. That's the first thing.
Thank you so much, Darren. As I said, we'll be sharing this recording afterwards. We'll go through, follow up all these sort of questions, a bit of a summary document as well, because there's been some fantastic ones coming in, because a lot of these are the 101s that people want to know.
We'll answer them. That's fine. That's great.
Awesome. Thank you,
Good.
Darren, for coming
Thank
along,
you
mate,
very
and
much.
joining me in the conversation. And thank you to everyone listening in
Terrific.
today. Take care.